Hello and welcome back as we begin to look at the endocrine system. A lot of what is covered here is really a review from labs such as the hormones and some of the target tissues by which those hormones act and the endocrine glands that secrete those hormones. But we're also going to be adding some other information into the mix and kind of giving you a little bit of a broader overview of everything that is considered the endocrine system. And so let's go ahead and start this. In this first video, we're actually going to be focused pretty much on the pituitary gland. There's two glands that I'm going to focus in on the most. The pituitary gland is one, and the adrenal gland is the other. Everything else we're going to kind of just highlight and mention. But there are some particulars about the pituitary and the adrenal gland that I really want to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of. These first couple slides here are really just some basics, things that you should know. You should already know what the endocrine system is. It's made up of the glands and the tissues and cells and the hormones that they secrete. We should also understand that hormones are a means of chemical communication. And so that is the major role of the endocrine system. It is to chemically communicate with the target tissues. Every hormone that is secreted by an endocrine gland has a target tissue or a target cell that it will bind to. Right? And that is how it conducts that chemical communication. And so as we go through a lot of these things, we will be talking about that. All right. Now, just as a mention here, the endocrine system is very analogous, if you would, to that of the nervous system. They both kind of do the same thing. Right? They both are communicating with target tissues. We know the nervous system communicates specifically with muscular tissue, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, whereas the endocrine system is going to be targeting other target tissues. But they're both communicating. The nervous system is communicating with or through neurotransmitters, right, that are going to be stimulated and released due to action potentials. The endocrine system is going to be using hormones as a means of that communication. Right? So they're not really relying on the electrical communication. Nervous system is much quicker to respond. Endocrine is much slower. And the effects of the endocrine system can last very short, right? A few seconds, up to hours. In the case of hormones such as epinephrine, all right, and norepinephrine, they can cause long-lasting impacts. Cortisol can cause long-lasting impacts. The nervous system is communicating within the neurotransmitter through precision. Right? So in other words, those neurotransmitters are being specifically released into that target tissue and nowhere else within the body. Whereas in the endocrine system, the endocrine gland has to release the hormone into the bloodstream, and that hormone circulates the cardiovascular system until it comes upon that target tissue that it needs to connect with. There is also some overlap between the endocrine and the nervous system. And so some neurotransmitters act as hormones and vice versa. Some hormones will act as neurotransmitters. Specifically, epinephrine, norepinephrine, antidiuretic hormone can be both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone can be both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. And so these are just some of those examples. Dopamine is also one of those that can be a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So sometimes we see them being serving dual purposes. The other thing, and we're going to talk more about this, oxytocin, all right, and epinephrine are secreted by what we call neuroendocrine cells. And these are specialized neurons that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Right, so if you think of a pituitary, right, a pituitary is an example of a neuroendocrine cell. Right, that's going to be secreting oxytocin and ADH into the bloodstream, but they are really neuroendocrine cells. Right? They are specialized neurons. Within the adrenal medulla, we see the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine being secreted by those same kind of neuroendocrine cells. And so they're actually directly stimulated by the nervous system. They are neural cells. They're just functioning in an endocrine capacity because they're secreting those hormones into the bloodstream. And so we do see a lot of overlap between, and there's a lot of co-regulation between the endocrine and the nervous system as well. Right. Of course, there's always a catch, and that is, once again, the endocrine system is secreting these hormones into the bloodstream, and they target specific cells, right, or they target specific organs. And what determines whether or not a hormone will act or stimulate a cell or an organ are the receptors. Right? The hormones are receptor specific. This here is just some terminology. You should be familiar with all of the terminology that is already listed here. You should know what exocrine versus endocrine is. We've talked about that in the digestive system. You should know what a hormone is. Paracrines are specialized hormones that do not act regionally. They act locally. Right, so in other words, paracrines are hormones that are going to be released within a very small area. Right? They're going to act on the receptors within that very small area and not travel widespread, not travel through the cardiovascular system or through the bloodstream. Prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are a type of paracrine that act normally, that initiates inflammatory response. And so these hormones would become released within damaged tissue, and those hormones stimulates inflammation. It stimulates swelling within the area. That is not something that you want to have done widespread throughout the entire body, for obvious reasons. You want inflammation to be regional. You want it to be localized. You want it to be controlled and not widespread. And so that's some of the functions of the paracrines. It's more of an immune response is what they coordinate. But they are still hormones, and they still act within a very endocrine-based system, just not widespread. Now, what I want to spend some time on, the remainder of our time on, is starting to look at the various endocrine glands and the hormones that they secrete. And to start that off with, what we're going to be looking at for the remainder of this video is the pituitary gland. Because the pituitary gland is a very complex gland. Once upon a time, it was considered to be the master gland because it actually regulates almost all of the other endocrine glands. And so we know that the pituitary gland secretes a total of 8 different hormones. 6 within the anterior pituitary, 2 within the posterior pituitary. But the reason why we cannot call the pituitary gland the master gland is because the pituitary is not self-regulating. The pituitary gland, in fact, takes its directives on which hormones to release from the hypothalamus, which makes the hypothalamus an endocrine gland. The hypothalamus secretes hormones, typically either stimulating or inhibiting, I should say either releasing or inhibiting hormones. All right, and so they're either going to cause hormones to be released within the pituitary gland, or they're going to inhibit hormones from being released from within the pituitary gland. And those hormones are delivered to the pituitary gland one of two ways, either through a neural conduction system, right, which is how the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary, or through a network of capillaries, and that's how we see the hypothalamus communicating with the anterior pituitary. And so we have this. We have two different systems of communicating with the pituitary gland. Why, you ask? Great question. And that's where the story starts to get interesting, because here's the whole pituitary gland right here. Right? Here's the hypothalamus. This structure called the infundibulum, right? This little stalk that hangs down. That infundibulum contains a network of neural fibers that directly connect into the posterior pituitary, right here. And in fact, it's the infundibular stalk that links the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And there's neural fibers, we're going to look at this here in a little bit, there's neural fibers that run through this infundibular stalk that allows for direct communication between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, we see something completely different. And in fact, if you remember from lab, the tissue looks very different. Anterior pituitary looks nothing like the posterior pituitary. Right? So we have two very glandular appearances between the anterior and the posterior pituitary, and we have two very different mechanisms of communication between the anterior and the posterior pituitary. And so you may ask, Young, what's going on with this? Why such differences within this gland? And the answer is, get comfortable, get ready, hope you're sitting. The answer is, they're two separate glands. The anterior pituitary is actually made up of two separate glands that have merged together. What am I talking about? The posterior pituitary, during embryological development, is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is actually dropped down through the infundibulum into the hypophyseal fossa of the sella tertia. Remember, that's a part of the sphenoid bone. Right? That's what you're looking at. That's what you're looking at. Right here. This is the sphenoid bone. This is the sella tertia. Right? This is the hypophyseal fossa. Right? And so during fetal development, that posterior pituitary was once a part of the hypothalamus, comes down through the infundibulum and sits in that fossa. The anterior pituitary is actually an extension of the pharynx. And so when you look at the histology of the pharynx, it looks very much like the anterior pituitary. And when you look at the histology of the posterior pituitary, it looks very similar to the hypothalamus. You actually see neural networks within the posterior pituitary. You actually see more reticular-like tissue in the anterior pituitary. That divergence is because they were, during fetal development, two separate glands that The anterior pituitary is moving up, the posterior pituitary is moving down, and they merge together through a structure called the pars intermedialis. Here's the pars intermedialis. That's what links the anterior and the posterior pituitary. But the pars intermedialis is only present during fetal development. This actually gets absorbed by the anterior pituitary. In animals, that pars intermedia stays present. And it's actually the pars intermedia that will go ahead and secrete the melatonin stimulating hormone, right? MSH. We know in humans that MSH is secreted by the anterior pituitary. And so that function of the pars intermedia kind of gets absorbed into the rest of the anterior pituitary. And it's also why there's a slight variation in the histology where you can actually see where the pars intermedia would have once been. But it is clearly a part of the anterior pituitary. So we have these two separate glands that have merged and fused together that histologically are very different. The hormones that they secrete are very different, and how the hypothalamus communicates with them is very different. The anterior pituitary is also what is known as the adenohypophysis. Why? Because this prefix adeno means glandular tissue. It means tissue or tissue of the body. Right? And so reticular tissue, which is what the anterior pituitary most resembles, because of where it's arised from, the back of the pharynx, is why this is now referred to as the adenohypophyseus. And so know that the adenohypophyseus is the same thing as saying the anterior pituitary. And you can see that it's got some specific regions and divisions of that. Right? So that the pars distalis is actually the anterior lobe right here. Right, so this is the anterior lobe. And the pars tuberalis is the part of the anterior pituitary that surrounds the infundibulum. Right, so the pars tuberalis is the part of the anterior pituitary that is surrounding the infundibulum. And the pars distalis, it's distal. It's distal from the infundibulum. This is why it's called distalis, because it is distal from the infundibulum. The pars distalis would be the main part of the anterior pituitary gland. And it is connected to the hypothalamus through what we call the hypophyseal portal system. And that is what you are seeing here. All right, so the hypophyseal portal system links or connects. This is it right here. The hypophyseal portal system is what you're seeing right there. All right, so this hypophyseal portal system is primarily made up of veins, right, and is delivering the either releasing or inhibiting hormones to that anterior pituitary. And you can see back over here, the posterior pituitary has just a regular network of capillaries, and this is strictly for the delivery of blood. So no hormones are actually delivered through this mechanism that we're looking at right there. The neurohypophysis is the posterior pituitary. So that's another name for the posterior pituitary. Neuro, because why? Because it is derived from the hypothalamus. Right? But know that this is the posterior pituitary gland. Right? That's the posterior pituitary. And it itself is made up of 3 distinct regions. The pars nervosa is the actual body of the posterior pituitary. Right? The infundibulum, or the infundibular stalk, right here, is what's actually carrying the neural networks, the neurons that become the tissue of the posterior pituitary, or is what actually contains the pituocytes. And then the median eminence is the area of the infundibulum, kind of where the infundibulum starts, and so it actually extends up into the hypothalamus. And so think of the median eminence as actually almost being the pathway by which the posterior pituitary took embryologically to come down into the sella tertia. Now again, and this is going to be where a large review of what you've already learned in lab. We know that the anterior pituitary has 6 hormones that they are secreting, right? While the posterior pituitary has 2. Here's the key difference here. The anterior pituitary has the ability to produce and release their 6 hormones. The posterior pituitary does not produce oxytocin or ADH. It's not produced in the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin and ADH are stored within the posterior pituitary, within those neuroendocrine cells, those pituocytes. They're not produced there, right? Whereas the anterior pituitary is producing both, producing and releasing their 6 hormones. Right? And again, the hormones of the hypothalamus, right? The hormones of the hypothalamus are listed at the top, and they are regulating the hormones that you see down here in the pink. So these guys right here are hormones from the hypothalamus. Notice that all of them are either releasing or inhibiting hormones. Right? And then these 6 hormones are the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone, as well as somatostatin, are all released from the hypothalamus. Whereas, and they do serve multiple functions as far as the hormones that they are regulating the release of. In the anterior pituitary, the hormones that the hypothalamic hormones are regulating is FSH, LH, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, growth hormone. We know MSH is in there, so there's actually a few other hormones that are not listed on there that we also need to take into account of. So it's actually more than 6 that are secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Not all of them are represented on the slide. And again, this here is just kind of a graphic of what hypothalamic hormones are regulating what anterior pituitary hormone. Once again, Once again, this is not a complete list, but this is a list of the major hormones. Just as a review, and this will help you guys out in the reproductive system as well. All right, remember that the role of follicle stimulating hormone is egg and sperm production. So in other words, helping to regulate oogenesis and spermatogenesis. Luteinizing hormone is really regulating ovulation. And testosterone. Production. All right. Thyroid stimulating hormone is regulating the thyroid, of course. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is regulating the adrenal gland. Prolactin is, again, testosterone secretion. Milk production, so on and so forth. Growth hormone, human growth hormone, what is typically referred to as HGH, that is regulating metabolism, growth, development. It's kind of overseeing everything. Fat metabolism, yeah, you name it. It's all kind of contained within that one region. And again, within the pituitary gland, we're seeing antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Right? So an oxytocin, where it's actually stimulating contraction along the vas deferens, right? To go ahead. So remember, it's not the cilia within the microvilli or the stereocilia along the vas deferens. That is not what is propelling the sperm through the vas deferens. What is propelling the sperm through the vas deferens is oxytocin, causing contraction of the smooth muscle. Right, that is lining the vas deferens. Remember, there is no semen going through the vas deferens. Semen does not start to be added to the sperm until you get to the seminal vesicles. Right, so the job of the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and the bulbourethral gland is to create that mixture of semen that's going to bathe the sperm. So until then, the sperm are kind of moving along an aqueous solution, kind of like a lazy river, and it's the job of oxytocin to go ahead and stimulate that muscular contraction to keep the sperm moving through the vas deferens. Of course, in females, oxytocin is going to be critical in regulating smooth muscle contraction within the uterus, right, for uterine contractions. Again, stimulating of milk production, maternal bonding within the infants, and of course we already understand ADH to a good deal because we've already looked at the urinary system. And so with that, I think you've had enough of introduction to the endocrine system and a look at the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, which is actually, again, two separate glands that have merged together into this one gland that has a superiority complex because it thinks it's the master gland when really it's being puppeteered by the hypothalamus. And so I will leave you on that note. Continue reviewing, continue studying, shoot me any questions that you have, and I will see you on the flip side.